The next most important person.
I think it's so wonderful we're doing it. I didn't realize we were doing this every time. So that was So are you doing it tonight? I am. Nice.
Hello.
Eddie. EB, Eddie Bishop.
It is there.
Soon as it hits 6, we'll go.
Grant's here.
I tried to get on remotely last time and I could not figure it out. Yeah, you did figure it out.
Okay,
Good deal.
ready.
Yes.
Welcome to the City of Lacey Planning Commission meeting of Tuesday, December 5th. I'd like to call the meeting to order. All commissioners are here.
On the 8th, so 1, 2, 3. Yeah.
Yeah,
Look at that.
you must have heard it was Mark's last meeting.
Nothing better than that.
Okay. I'd like to take a minute for Daphne to read, she said she would read the land acknowledgement.
We, the City of Lacey, are on the ancestral land of the tribal people of the Treaty of Medicine Creek, including the Nisqually Indian Tribe and Squaxin Island Tribe. We acknowledge and remember those tribal people not recognized today who were absorbed or relocated into other tribes for survival. We recognize the ancestors and their descendants who are still here. We recognize and respect the tribal people of the Treaty of Medicine Creek as the traditional stewards of this land since time immemorial, and their role today in taking care of these lands in perpetuity. We recognize and have the responsibility to call attention to the histories of the disposition, forced removal, and abridged treaty rights that allowed our nation, state, and city to develop as it has today. We recommend that community members read the Medicine Creek Treaty of 1854.
Thank you, Daphne. I'm looking for an approval of the agenda and consent agenda items.
So moved.
Second.
Moved and seconded. Any discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, we have an agenda. Now we're looking for public comment.
So this is the opportunity to address the planning commission. Any members of the public that want to speak can do so. We don't have anybody here in council chambers. I'm not seeing anybody in the attendees list on Zoom either, but just in case if there are, this would be your opportunity to address planning commission. Use the raise hand function of the webinar. We can go ahead and bring you in. Going once, going twice. So I think it's safe to say we don't have any members of the public wishing to give testimony tonight.
Okay, we will move on to commission member reports. Judith?
I can report that I attended the lights parade last night. And for just a moment, the skies parted and there wasn't rain, so it was really fortunate. And I know that Santa is supposed to be the star, but by my account, the stars were the City of Lacey landscape people who were on zero clearance mowers, fully decked out and doing pivots in the street, and the kids were thrilled. And then they went up around some of the other vehicles and then they circled back and they really put on quite a show.
Daphne?
I can say I got stopped in traffic while waiting for that, but I didn't realize the route, but no other report.
Mark?
No report?
No report from me. Gail?
I second the comments on the parade. That was great. Yeah.
Jeff?
No report.
Okay.
Yeah, I also went to the parade. That was my son's favorite. But when we were for me personally, the miniature horse car has been my favorite 3 years in a row. So it's really fun. A lot of my neighbors get into it, and a couple of them actually have their own floats. But yeah, I also attended a meeting where inclusionary housing was discussed, and I had to research a little bit. And I saw that, I was reading about the Puget Sound inclusionary housing And I was just wondering if something like that was something that was implemented in our Thurston County where those where, you know, it's mandatory for all developments to, or a certain amount of developments to have that affordable housing. And I didn't know if there was something that has been presented that I can't recall, or if that was something that had even been discussed in Lacey.
Yeah, so it has been discussed in the past. So what you're talking about is also known as like inclusionary zoning, which basically sets forth requirements. So if you do a certain number of housing units in a development, a certain percentage are required to be affordable and meet a certain income requirement. And so that is actually a strategy that's outlined in our housing action plan as a future potential action item. We've brought this idea, this concept to the council in the past and have received a relatively lukewarm reception to it. I'll say that hasn't been the most favorable in terms of the council's priorities and wanting to address housing issues. They're, I think, more favorable towards those things that we can do to work within kind of the range of the market to try to get more affordable housing. So things like our pre-approved accessory dwelling unit program, waiving of permit fees for nonprofit and actually for-profit developers. We do that now as well, as long as the development meets certain income requirements. Waiving certain permit fees or lowering permit fees for certain sizes of houses. We actually have a permit fee that's less if you do a 1,400 square foot or smaller house. So those are the things that the council has prioritized, those things that might help build more kind of, I'll say, market rate, lower scale, lower end of the market rate housing, rather than requiring the inclusionary zoning. And the way that it's kind of been put out from the council is that they would rather use kind of with the carrot and the stick kind of analogy, is that they would rather use kind of the carrot rather than the stick. So they would rather incentivize to try to get the type of development that we're wanting rather than requiring. And so having said that, though, it's not to say that the inclusionary zoning might not be, you know, brought up sometime in the future as a requirement, especially if it gets to the point where we're just not seeing it, you know, the low income like we should. And so that's something we'll certainly be kind of going through as we update the housing element of our comprehensive plan and looking at what our housing needs are. And I'll actually just kind of, you know, maybe make a little bit of a promo on this, is that the City Council at their meeting on, I guess that's December 14th, will be briefed on TRPC's work to look at our housing needs in terms of our next 20-year projections related to income levels. And what you'll see if you do attend that, just kind of the very quick synopsis, is we need more housing of all types, but really for Lacey, it's at the very lowest of the low income. So it's like 50% and less AMI, area median income. Or interestingly enough, it's also the very top end of the market to 120% plus. And the reason being is that over the last 20-30 years, Lacey has built a lot of smaller tract home developments that have served that kind of 80% to 120% market. That standard single family market that you see out there has really been kind of served by Lacey's, you know, housing boom in the last 20-30 years. So
when the city council says things like that, like we'd rather incentivize rather than, you know, set a, do they at that point decide how to measure whether those incentives are working or not?
That's a good question. I don't think so. That's not something that we've necessarily tracked. It's hard to track what is being constructed and what income levels are. It's something that is usually takes a census or something like that to be able to measure. But that's certainly something that I think we can analyze with our comp plan update, is how successful have we been in getting,
right,
you know, housing for all income ranges.
And if we have those measures to forgive certain fees and so on, we ought to be able to at least add up those numbers and see where we are.
Yeah, and
It's a nice thing to say, but if you have no way to quantify it, it's a little difficult.
and it brings up another good point, which is, we may have incentives, but do people take advantage of them?
Exactly.
And so that's stuff I know off the top of my head, which is for the fee waivers, we, as far as I'm aware, there has not been a for-profit developer come in and take advantage of the fee waiver program since it's been, I think it was adopted in 2021. And then we've had a nonprofit fee waiver for even longer than that. That one goes back probably about 2015 or so. We've had one development that I can think of in particular that's taken advantage of that, and that's the Habitat for Humanity development, Deo Vista on 37th Avenue, west of College Street, that's taken advantage of that. There may be some other smaller ones, but that's been the primary one there. So we can definitely pull those numbers, but at least on the private side, I'm confident that not a lot have
Not a
taken
lot
it.
has occurred.
Yeah.
Well, and then on the state law side, there are incentives for affordable housing within state law too.
Right.
If they were to try to mandate it, how would they do that?
You simply require as a requirement of the development that a certain percentage be held in made affordable. What that does require is it does require oversight, it requires reporting. So, you're required to provide information back to the city that you're abiding by certain income requirements. So you can't rent to people that make too much money. And if you do, then you may need to, find them other housing somewhere else. People can't sublease, there's a lot of those kind of things that once you start diving into that, it takes a lot more administration to oversee it than what we have currently available to us in terms of our staff resources right now to oversee.
Stratified by the size of the development? Yes.
Yes, yeah, yep. And it could also be based on, single family versus multifamily. Some I think only really apply it to multifamily development where you're in more of a rental situation and it's a little easier to maybe monitor and maintain than it is single family where you have to get into, looking at deed restrictions and, at the time of transfer, the city has to be involved to verify people's income. It gets really complex.
In another department?
Yeah, just about.
Yeah, it's difficult.
Okay, anything else? Alrighty, department report.
Yep, so I have a few things here. The first is last week, Hans and I last Tuesday, attended a Board of County Commissioners meeting for the joint plan. So you all sat through the plan commission process and heard that. We sat through some county commissioner briefings and actually briefed them on the plan as well. They'd actually voted on. So some of the things they were voting on were counter to what the planning commission recommended, including the low density zone consolidation. The county commissioners were favorable towards that. So what they did was they packaged it all together and were ready to adopt the whole suite of county comprehensive plan amendments that included the Lacey joint plan, the Yelm joint plan, the Olympia joint plan, a number of county initiatives, the Grand Mountain sub-area plan. This was a significant effort by Thurston County to do this. And at the last minute, it got pulled because of some potential, we have some new commissioners and there's some potential concerns with some of the things in the package and the low density zone consolidation was mentioned specifically. And so one of the commissioners, the new commissioner was installed that morning, went to her first county commission meeting, and one of the first things that was done was voted on to pull that from the agenda because she needed more time to be able to, I think, digest some of the ideas associated with the low density zone consolidation. So we're working with county staff to address the commissioner's concerns, and that is now scheduled to be adopted a week from today on December 12th. So we're optimistic that we'll be able to work through whatever issues there are with the new commissioner between now and next week. Let's see, we've got a number of interviews coming up in the next couple weeks. The first of which I'll mention is related to our new Community and Economic Development Director. So as you're aware, we've been without a director in our department since Rick became, first of all, interim city manager, now permanent. So roughly about a year, we've been without a department director, and so Thursday and Friday, we'll be doing interviews for that position. I believe Chair Wasson is going to sit in there. So there's 3 different panels. There's a staff panel, a director panel made up of other department directors, and then a community panel. And I think Dave is on the community panel, which is a broad group of stakeholders from around the community and provides the Planning Commission's perspective on that. So appreciate it. And then the week following, we will have some more interviews, and this time it will be for new planning commission members. So after the first of the year, we'll be down 3 members, and so Gail is going to sit and do interviews with the mayor and I next week to interview. So we've got 5 interviews that we'll be doing for the 3 vacant positions. One of those vacant positions will be Mark's position as a UGA member. So one of the 3 will be a UGA member. So thanks to Gail for doing that. Dave, I know that you probably would have volunteered, but I knew you were doing this thing this week. Plus, you know, you're not gonna actually be on the planning commission next year, which is weird to say, like, you know, because you've been so active in it for so long. Let's see. So that brings me to the last thing on at least on my list, which was just to first mainly thank Dave and Mark for their time on the Planning Commission. Both of you, it's been fantastic to work with you both over the years here. I went back and looked, and both of your first meetings were basically within a month of each other. So Dave started in February of 2018, and Mark's first meeting was in March of 2018. And so we bring, 6 years essentially of institutional knowledge to the Planning Commission that will be greatly missed as we filled those new positions. So I went back and looked at some of the things that you all had worked on over the years, the Depot District Sub-Area Plan, pedestrian bicycle plan, a lot of homeless and housing related initiatives, our affordable housing plan and our housing action plan, an update to our shoreline master program, our urban forest management plan, climate initiatives related to the Thurston Climate Mitigation Plan. And then Dave, I put this one especially in for you, which is stormwater.
Yeah.
The revolving door. Yeah, revolving door of various stormwater plans and codes and those kinds of things. And so,
Very important, right, this week.
yeah.
Right?
Yeah. So again, I just really wanted to thank you both for your time. I know from a staff perspective, you guys make it really easy to work with the Planning Commission, and Dave for chairing the meetings, and both of you for your time. I did want to mention that they both, and I've heard from Dave, but I haven't heard from you, Mark, yet, but the city council is going to be recognizing you for your time on the Planning Commission. And I believe that's on January 9th, I think. Is that?
I had the 16th.
Oh, is that the 16th? You're right. It's gonna be the 16th. The 9th would be a work session. So January 16th.
Okay, thanks.
That's gonna be at 6 o'clock here in City Hall.
And Mark and I, towards the end of this meeting, we have each some things we want to say,
Okay,
I'm sure.
sounds great. Anything else, Grant? Nothing, Grant. I think we're good.
Okay.
Yeah. Just ditto. Thank you both so much. I know I haven't been here very long, but it's just been a pleasure working with both of you and all of you. So thank you.
Perfect.
Okay, thank you. Any questions for Ryan that you have? Great, we'll move on we will now suspend the regular meeting. And we will open up the public hearing on the capital facilities plan update. That's handled by Ryan.
Yeah, so I'll maybe give just a very brief overview. We don't have any members of the public here in the room, nor do I see anybody on Zoom. The planning commission was briefed on this at your last meeting. I'm happy to go through the highlights of the presentation that was given at the last meeting. I know there were some members that weren't here that may want to see some of that information. It's kind of at the planning commission's option, how much of that information you'd like to see. So I guess that's a question for the commission. Is I can run through some of the slides if that.
I wasn't here, but I did read, so.
Okay.
Fine.
Okay, you all are good. So just a quick reminder, there's kind of two parts of this. First of all is the capital facilities plan. The capital facilities plan, just as a reminder, is an inventory of our existing facilities and a forecast for the future needs of those facilities, and then a 6-year plan that shows how we're going to pay for those things. So that is a document that is quite extensive. It was attached to your packet, and it's basically kind of I'll say a laundry list of different projects. It comes from a number of different sources, and those are usually our own utility, our own individual master plans for what that kind of section oversees. So for example, our utility sections, if that's stormwater, wastewater, drinking water, those are all covered under separate plans, and that's where those capital facilities come from. And that's what your rates, when you pay as a ratepayer, that's what your rates pay for is upgrading and doing things with those systems. And then also our parks plan is another vital one where those capital facilities come from, our parks capital facilities plan as well. The last update was done in 2019. This is a significant rewrite of our capital facilities plan, and I'll just say that there's only been a couple differences in the version that was presented at the last meeting versus this one, and they're all fairly, they're not technical in nature. They're adding more like photos, added maps and those kinds of things to this version that you have for the hearing tonight versus what you saw at the last meeting. Also included in this is something that's called the Government Facilities Master Plan. And this is the first time that the city of Lacey has ever done a kind of wholesale assessment of all of our building needs. So things like City Hall, our city maintenance shop facility down on College Street, basically any kind of building, even animal services, on Martin Way, anything that the city owns and maintains. We did an analysis and looked at how those facilities should change and grow over time. And so this will help kind of guide our future investments in our buildings as we grow as a community. And so a lot of those capital projects that you see in the capital facilities plan that are in that government facilities section come directly out of that government facilities master plan.
That includes the police.
Correct. Right. So it includes the new police station, which I understand the bids for that will be entertained or a decision made on those by the council at their meeting next week. And I think the bids came in fairly favorably as well. So they came in below the engineer's estimate, which is good news because what we've been seeing up until recently is that the construction costs have been very, very high. And so I think there was a little tension there as far as if we had enough money budgeted towards it, but it looks like there's more than enough to adequately serve the needs of the police station.
Are there restrictions on the bidding as far as, what kind of business, where their home office is? Is there anything relative to that, or is it pretty much just a cost decision?
Yeah, so there's no requirements as far as like location. You can be probably anywhere. I don't know if you can be outside the country, but we had a company I saw somebody from Chicago here to bid on it. And then what they'll do is they take all the bid information and then they need to establish who is a qualified bidder. And in order to be qualified, you need to have a certain kind of portfolio of these projects in the past. And basically we reach out, I think, to others that have worked with them on projects and interviewed them and those kinds of things to ensure that they're capable of doing these types of projects. So there's a little bit of due diligence, I think, to be able to do that, but there's no real hard and fast rules about who can and can't bid on things.
I know when I was on council, we always liked it when one of the local companies were the successful bidder, but a lot of the weight gets put on if we worked with them before. so that we know that they can actually deliver what they say they're gonna deliver.
Yeah.
So the police station is a fairly major one that's very much short term because the bids are gonna be open here soon. The other one that I'll just point to is animal services. Animal services, for those that might not have been at the presentation, our animal services building is on Martin Way. It's actually in Olympia, but it's owned and maintained by the city of Lacey. And that building is in severe decline. We spent, over $1 million last year just keeping the doors open. It's literally, not gonna last much longer. And so.
Say it's a real dog.
So anyway, that's another fairly short term, right now, a project that will be coming up here relatively soon. Right now, they're doing some preliminary work to maybe find a different suitable site around the community, and then fund a new animal shelter. So stay tuned on that. There's future decisions to be made on that, but that's gonna be another relatively big project here in the short term. And having walked through both the police station and animal services is much worse off than the police station, but the police station is getting a new building. So just keep that in mind that, there's facilities that are even worse off than our police station in our community. So, so with that, happy to turn it over to you for any questions. Kind of the next step in this is to make a recommendation to the city council. This will go to the council probably in the 1st of January, around the first meeting in January for their review. This has been a substantial 2-year long process to update this, probably the biggest project I've ever been associated with outside of a comprehensive plan update. It's been multiple work sessions with our director team, with various different city department groups, multiple briefings with the council, those kinds of things. So I'm imagining once it gets through the plan commission to the council, it's pretty well vetted. I don't think anything will really change as a result of this last review by the council.
So before we have any questions, just for technical, just to be on spot, could you re-ask if there's anybody in the audience?
Yep. So if there's anybody in the audience that wants to make testimony on the capital facilities plan, this is the time to be able to do that. You can use the raise hand function. And we'll go ahead and bring you in so that you can make comment. Anybody other than staff would like to? Seeing none, I think it's safe to close the public hearing.
Do you want them to ask questions
Oh,
in the public hearing?
It doesn't matter. You can close it and then just open the regular meeting. And
So we are now closing the public hearing. And if you have questions on anything for Ryan, feel free to speak up. Oh, yep, go ahead, Eddie.
Just to kind of piggybacking on what Dave asked, Ryan, did we get any feedback through any other channels from the public, any emails or?
Nope, we did not. No, thanks for clarifying or asking that question, Eddie. We did not receive any public comment, no emails, written, nothing.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so hearing none, I'm looking for a motion to move this forward to council.
So move.
What is the actual what are we?
Recommending approval of the capital facility plan and the government facilities master plan to the city council.
And we have motion by Jeff.
A second.
Let's let Mark get his.
That's fair.
Okay, any discussion?
So this morning, county commissioners had their legislative breakfast. First one in 4 years, since before COVID, yeah, we used to do it every year.
Wow.
One of the commissioner's legislative items is to pursue more state funding for animal control. And part of that pitch is the new building.
Yeah, so the way I think that we have, if it's an agreement of some sort, an interlocal agreement that basically says, how all the funds get kind of put into a pot that serves animal services. So it's between Thurston County and the cities of Olympia, Lacey, and Tumwater. And Lacey's the way the agreement works is that because Lacey owns and maintains the building, and those are, all animal services employees are Lacey employees, that we get some additional credit so that that's kind of how we fund, at least. I don't know if it's all of our portion of animal services or not, but a good portion of our funding comes through the support of the building and the staff. So, our budget is for that, not necessarily paying, we'll say, cash out of our budget to support the
And
animal
that
services.
agreement stays in force as it.
Correct. So at least for the time being, there may be future discussions that might amend that agreement, but for the time being, the city is the one actually taking the lead on trying to find the new property and build the new building and those kinds of things, because we are under the existing agreement are essentially kind of the ones in charge of that part of animal services.
So we can be in county, Tumwater, Lacey, Olympia, as far as we purchase land, it could be anywhere within that.
Correct, and that's what they're doing right now, is they're doing some feasibility on what parcels may be available. And they're also doing some analysis looking at where their call volumes are coming in. Primarily it should be no surprise, the call volumes are in the Olympia, Lacey, Tumwater area, and not so many in South Thurston County. And so long term, they're looking at locating most likely a new facility in Olympia, Lacey, or Tumwater, because if you moved, let's say, to South County and you're driving all the time, the long-term costs associated with that are much higher than maybe buying up more.
So they'll look at South Sound Center. I mean, it just sits there, right?
Does, I think their focus is on kind of two things. Number one is a property maybe underutilized that's already jurisdictional owned that we could just transfer. So, let's say it's a piece of property, maybe a jurisdictional entity owns that they're not using. Maybe we could utilize it for animal services purposes, or I think they're looking at things that are already on the market. So it would be a longer discussion if a property wasn't on the market to be able to purchase.
I
Okay.
did see a video on a social media platform reminding people that if you register your animals, you're partially funding the animal shelter. And I don't think a lot of people are aware of that. But that was a great public service announcement. I think it was on a Facebook platform that I saw it. Just to remind everybody why you're doing that and how it benefits.
Yeah.
And of course, helping get your animal back home, right?
Right.
If it gets lost, that it's registered, but the funding aspect, I thought was a great point to share with everyone.
Yep, and animal services is a little unique in that in some of their funding, they can do more fundraising than a typical city project. So they do, they can do a capital campaign. So that'll be another part of the project as well as, things like donations and those kinds of things that usually, the city is not out soliciting donations from its residents to build, say, a new police department, but that's something that the animal shelter can do.
There's no more questions. We will take a vote. All those in favor of the motion? Opposed? Carried. We will now move on to new business, Planning Commission rules of procedure revisions. And Ryan, because he likes talking a lot.
Yeah, so in your packet, there is an amended draft to our Planning Commission rules of procedure. The last time this was updated was 2022, so fairly recent. I went through and looked to see if there were any other adjustments that needed to be made. I really didn't see much because the last time we had touched this was back just a year and a half ago or so. So the main part of the reason to amend the Planning Commission rules of procedures, number one, is because of the switch in the meeting dates. Then we need to amend the rules of procedures to say that we go from first and third Tuesdays to second and fourth Wednesdays. So that's the first portion of it. And then the second is the land acknowledgement part, which has been added as a new section to the meeting portion of the rules of procedure that basically state that the Planning Commission recognizes the rules of procedure, will add it to every meeting agenda, and then it'll also be spoken aloud by a member at the beginning of the meeting. So that is basically in keeping with the procedures that you're already doing, but just kind of memorializing it in the the rules of procedure document. So with that, just requesting that the planning commission review this information, provide any edits, and then if you don't have any edits, then by motion, approve the rules of procedure. The one thing that I will say is that the council has not yet formally moved their meeting date. It's on the agenda. It's on Thursday's agenda. I'm 99.99% sure that they're going to do that change. They've already been talking about how they could do it sooner rather than later. So if for some reason it doesn't go through, we'll come back to the planning commission and have to adjust. But there's a lot of wheels in motion that, you know, we're already kind of scheduled meetings for after the first of the year based on the assumption that the council is going to move to Tuesdays. So I would say it's extremely unlikely that that would happen. But if that was the case, we can address it if we need to.
Tuesdays back then.
Yeah.
So is there, since we've kind of talked about settling on the second and fourth Wednesday, even if the council doesn't move their meeting, is there any reason why we can't?
You can certainly do that, because we went back and looked at the current schedule specifically for this room, and there's nobody right now that has that second and fourth Wednesdays. So yeah, that is one possible outcome, is that we just keep those.
And that way it makes it clean and easy for us.
Yeah.
We're not feeling like we're in flux.
Nope. So yeah, we'd be good to go on that.
Efficiency.
I do have a clarifying question from what was in the packet. So could you help me understand under new letter G? It says that the commission work sessions, public meetings and deliberations are all informal. How are they all informal? Because I thought the public meetings were so formal. You had to announce it, open it, have certain rules and then close it at a certain way. How are they all equally characterized as informal? Just to educate.
I think the intent of this section, so this isn't new, this is something that's been, you know, on the rules of procedure before, is that while there are certain portions of your meeting which are formal, you have an agenda, you make motions and approve them and do those kinds of things. The conduct of the meeting, the discussion part, is relatively informal. So that includes, like, you know, if you have, you know, so in the past, we've had people with concerns that we've actually brought to the table to talk to the planning commission about it. We hold brainstorming sessions on stuff. We do, you know, those kinds of, so I think it's a recognition of that. Not so much that you still hold a meeting and you still have, you know, formalities in terms of the agendas and the motions and the chair and the vice chair and the voting. But I think this really gets to, you know, the deliberations of the planning commission are to be informal, as it says, and then facilitated by the planning commission chair. So those discussions that you have, you know, the back and forth, which we really get a lot out of, you know, facilitated by the chair is kind of that, so that we're not, you know, we're not formally structuring the meeting, so you get 2 minutes to talk, and then Daphne gets 2 minutes, you know, those kinds of things.
So
it's a
it
little-
refers to the tone of the meetings.
Correct.
More than a lack of structure.
Right.
That way I don't have to tow in Cadman all the
You're my favorite mentor, Dave.
time.
And you don't have to go through Robert's Rules of Order and all of that. However, to get something done.
Does that help you, Judith?
Yes, thank you. That was my one.
Had we last amended it because of the COVID when we came and changed the time? Is that when?
Yeah,
last did
we
it?
changed the times, yeah, yep. And there were some outdated references, some outdated code sections. The last one was more of a cleanup of some outdated stuff that we needed to change, and so it had more substance to it than what you have tonight. Tonight's, you know, we've kind of already gone through this with a fine tooth comb, you know, a year and a half ago, so it's just really just getting this stuff done and taken care of.
So do we make a motion on it and then council also votes on this too, or?
Council will vote on it as well, yeah. Yeah, they don't vote on your meeting times, that's up to you to decide. They will vote on their own meeting.
Oh,
schedules.
but they don't,
They don't
this
vote
is,
on
this stops with us?
Yes.
Okay, gotcha, that's our sorry.
The one time we actually get to make.
Yeah. Some authority here.
Unless, oh no. Okay, so. I'm trying to remember who moved and seconded.
I don't think it's been moved and
This one
seconded.
hasn't
Okay,
been.
so a motion,
I move to adopt the changes in the rules of procedure for the Lacey Planning Commission.
moved and seconded. Any more discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Carries.
Thanks. Oh, just before you move on, Dave, I'll email this out to everybody tomorrow so that you have the
Except
final.
me.
For those that care.
You guys don't care.
I've already,
We should plan for this for January. We will start this.
correct.
Yeah. it
Yep,
says
so
January.
we'll talk about the schedule at the end of tonight, but the first meeting in January is January 10th.
10, yeah.
So that'll be your first regular meeting, and then the joint work session is January 23rd, which will be on the council's new night of Tuesday, January 23rd, so.
I will be here on that.
Okay, we're gonna move on to old business. Yes, Hans Gruber Shepherd is here to talk about
In honor of
the-
Christmas?
the draft neighborhood commercial amendment. Mr. Senior Planner.
Best Christmas movie out there. So. All right. Start by sharing my screen as I do. All right. Hopefully everybody can see that. So this is going to be largely picking up where we left off at our last meeting. Between our last meeting and tonight, we took it to the Land Use and Environmental Committee and actually presented essentially the same slides that we ran through last time to that group as well. Gained some additional feedback, and it sounds like we're coming back around for a third time, potentially at our joint meeting in January with both council and the Planning Commission to kind of discuss it as a large group. So yeah, we are still kind of in that fall to winter zone, working on those draft updates and then moving into adoption here. Yeah, so some of these early slides are going to be looking rather familiar. This is, again, just to help get everybody oriented. We have a cluster to the north and to the south. I did want to highlight one discussion point here. This, a lot of the feedback that we've received through the outreach process is either centralized around kind of the north end of the city or the south end. There are some common themes that were more strongly represented specifically to the north, and those include grocery stores, gas stations, and kind of the interplay of larger trucks and kind of other transportation uses. And while those were discussed to some degree within the feedback that we received, just by and large, there was kind of an additional emphasis that we heard through this process to the north end of town. So it's one of the discussions following that was whether or not we want to actually fine tune each one of these districts to the geographic location that it exists within the city, or if we want to kind of take a kind of broader brush approach where all of the design characteristics, the allowed uses, all the different code really just kind of applies evenly across all these districts. And so the recommendations that we're going to run through tonight, or the potential recommendations, I say, don't necessarily capture that geographic component, but that is something that may be worth keeping in mind as we kind of run through the rest of these slides, that is an option if that becomes something that we want to take a larger look at and kind of take the opportunity to further fine tune each one of these districts. So I'll circle back around to that in a little bit, but just to keep that in the back of your mind at this point. And then while on this topic, some other kind of commonly shared themes that were more just entirely across the city, and all the feedback that we heard had to do with accessibility and human scale, supportive infrastructure for that kind of specifically human scale. So getting to and from these districts, having that local emphasis, and then architectural compatibility. So how well these districts fit in within the surrounding neighborhood. And that's not to say that the grocery stores and gas stations and truck interaction wasn't something that was discussed everywhere. It was just more specifically discussed to the north, and then also specifically discussed in the context of Meridian Market, which is not terribly surprising, as that was a big motivator of this process at the very beginning. But again, just something to think about as we move forward within this slide deck that we're looking at here. We already talked or discussed architectural compatibility last time around. But again, it's just a good reminder that these districts fit within the context of these larger design requirements. So everything that we're looking at tonight is kind of building upon and in addition to these other just underlying design requirements that exist for all districts within the city. So getting into, the last two slides here are kind of the tail end of what we talked about last time around. So making kind of more of a push towards that 80%. So right now, max development coverage is listed at 70. So based on the feedback that we've received to date, so that's community feedback, business feedback, council feedback, internal kind of staff review, and then feedback that we're hearing from you. And this is kind of adaptive, so it can change as we move on and as discussions kind of lead us in that direction. But right now, kind of focusing on that 80% development coverage, bumping that up from 70%. And then that max building coverage, right now it's at 50%, maintaining that, but also creating an opportunity to expand that depending on how parking is used on the site. So either street parking or below grade, creating a larger opportunity for more kind of interactive spaces that aren't really vehicle centric. So those are the two recommendations that are kind of coming out of that section of the code so far. And feel free to jump in at any time. I'm doing a little bit of a recap here, but hopefully we'll have a discussion throughout this and at the end. So if there's any questions or comments, feel free to jump in. And then proposed building sizes. So this is what we touched on a little bit at the end of our last meeting. So it's really just a summary of all of those a little bit again. The one change from last time that we all met was this multi-commercial. So that dropping it down from 25 to 17, which really translates to a 2-story building based on the building coverage allowed. And then the multifamily was still at that kind of 3-story range. So it's whether or not it's 850 square feet stacked up on top of each other 2 times or 3 times. And a lot of the thought process behind this is that we really don't have 3-story commercial buildings that are looking to be in these locations. They really don't make sense, and there's just not really a demand for it. So there wasn't something that we identified as a need to accommodate within these districts really. But so single commercial uses right around that 6,000 square feet, that really seems to match everything that was a single kind of standalone use that was identified, with the caveat of grocery stores and preschools. Grocery stores is still relatively large compared to a lot of the example grocery stores that we looked at, but we want to be accommodating to that as much as possible. So that is kind of the largest single use that's allowed there. And that is a gross floor area coverage. So whether that's stacked up on top of each other or one single story, that 30,000 square foot is that limit. And then preschools, again, that's a total square footage. So that could be 5,000 square foot, 2 stories. So 1 story on top of the other, or that could be just a 10,000 square foot single story. Multifamily, a little bit larger. This is pretty characteristic of the types of multifamily that we see going in within Lacey around town. And then that mixed use is really kind of the large end of the spectrum that currently is how our code is written. So it's either that single use or that mixed use, and that's at that 40,000 square feet. Given there is still that limitation of 10,000 square feet of building coverage, so smaller in scale as far as a footprint goes, but they can go vertically. So that would be potentially a 4-story building if that becomes something that we want to accommodate. So that was a bit of a recap. And then one of the discussion points that we talked about at our last meeting was height, and especially height as it relates to adjacent residential uses. So as it's currently written, 35 feet is the maximum height allowed within these districts. And then based on the feedback that we've received, we wanted to bump that up to 40 feet, just really because 35 is a weird middle ground that doesn't quite accommodate 3-story buildings. So there's some additional height opportunity there, but we're really not seeing 3-story buildings in practice. So bumping it from 35 to 40 makes that a little bit more possible within these districts. So that's why we see that 40 feet show up there. And then there was a discussion of increasing the maximum allowance up to 55 feet, provided the top 2 floors are used for residential uses. So Again, that has a lot to do with bringing in residential uses, the number of residential units within these zones to really support that primary use of commercial development, to really make sure that there's extended areas of activity throughout the day, and that there's more residential units there to ensure the success of these commercial sites. And then here are these next two bullets have specifically to do with the relationship of structures within neighborhood commercial districts and how they relate to adjacent residential uses. That was something that we talked about a bit. So one of the bullets here is step back above 35 feet at a ratio of 1.5 feet for every one vertical foot when located next to a low density residential use. And this would actually be slightly more restrictive than our code as it's currently written, in the sense that it would require a little bit more of a gap between commercial uses and low density residential uses when they exist along a property line. And then the bullet underneath this could actually is another option that would potentially take that a step further. And it says building heights will not exceed 35 feet within 50 feet of an existing single family detached residential unit. So there's a couple different ways to get at this, a couple different ways to describe it. These two different lines could work in tandem with each other. We could choose to take one of them or both of them. Just some ideas and options on how to really kind of approach that and describe that instance when it takes place within these districts, and really how to ensure that those residential units and lots are protected when they're adjacent to these commercial uses. I don't know if there's any feedback on that. A lot of this is kind of born out of discussion we had at our last meeting.
I just had a question, Hans. So you're saying at 40 feet, we're not gonna get 4 floors? We're gonna still be only at 3 floors? Just, I'm assuming just with whatever in between floors, whatever kind of plumbing or, whatever is, so I'm not an expert on construction height, but, so 40 feet is not gonna get 4 stories.
Correct. In practice, that's 40 feet is still a 3-story building. Once you factor in the space between floors, typically the bottom floor has a little bit more height to it than 10 feet. So yeah, that's still in practice. Typically what we're looking at there is a 3-story building. Right now we're at 35 feet, and in practice that is a 2-story building. When you factor in kind of the pitch of the roof, the second or the first floor maybe being a little bit taller, the between floors and everything that kind of goes into a building, you really don't get so it doesn't cleanly go up by 10 feet at a time. So there's a lot of other additional space in there that's made up it. So
If they're flat roofs with outdoor living on the roof, is that considered in the height?
So talking about like a rooftop garden kind of patio?
Yeah, like, if they have a patio up there with a railing or, barbecues or whatever, is that considered in the height?
So that would not be. If they did something like some kind of awning or covered zone or anything like that, or the railing, things like that, any kind of fixed structural component that's added to the top would be included in that height. But the patio itself wouldn't necessarily change that height limitation.
So you can see on this diagram here where it says base height, that's where the height is measured from basically the parapet, or, if this is a flat roof building, the parapet wall all the way down to the bottom, yeah. So, that would be the measurement that couldn't be any taller than 40 feet. And then, like Hans was saying, anything that was in the middle of that, it couldn't exceed, if they're gonna do anything that was a permitted structure in here in this, in this area, they couldn't exceed 40 feet.
Well, because not so much here in Lacey, but if you travel to Seattle, almost everything's putting patios up on top of the buildings. And so, that does add an element of height to it. I just wanted to know, is that going to be considered in whatever we do, or do we need to be specific in relative to that? Because it does create you know, you're of course gonna have railings for safety and things
Yeah.
like that, and maybe an outdoor kitchen or something you're adding in, you know, I don't know. So I just wondered how that would be perceived, or do we need to be specific about that? Cause that seems to be the trend with some of these.
Yeah, so our code doesn't specifically address that one or the other right now. This is definitely an opportunity to speak to that if that's something that we want to make sure is captured within this code. I did include this bullet here at the bottom that says utility boxes, antennas, and other roof fixtures shall be located to reduce visual impacts on adjacent uses. So that plays more into when something is coming in for design review, that we can kind of factor in those additional maybe rooftop features to make sure that maybe they're stepped back an additional distance to lessen that impact on adjacent uses. So there's ways to phrase it that can give us some level of kind of influence when those applications are coming in. But yeah, we can also use incorporate specific language that would address rooftop patios and things like that, if that feels like the right option at this point. Yeah.
What do you think about privacy? Is that kind of the main concern?
Yeah, and I'm thinking of some of the things like Kirian talked about last time, and so the higher these get, and if somebody's rooftop and they're sitting up there at, you know, 40 feet, that's a significant, and, you know, they're up there outdoors, and so they're not looking out a window. So I think from the privacy aspect, if we're next to single family usage, I think that's really something we should be cognizant of, because otherwise I think we could have some issues. So I think it would be better overtly addressed.
I think it would also add a lighting component, because it could add a negative influence of light on the adjacent single family homes. If there's a outdoor kitchen and entertaining space, you're going to be out there at night with.
It's just the reality of what I see in like the Seattle area, where they are tearing down homes and they're putting in multi-story and mixed use. And so I think it's the trend. It capitalizes on space and.
Yeah. So right now the language is that anything above 35 feet would be stepped back 1.5 feet for every vertical foot. So say you had a 3-story, 40-foot building with some form of patio gathering space on the roof. Right now, based on that language, that would be stepped back a couple feet, but we could add additional language in there that would more specifically address patios. Do you have any ideas on what
roofs?
I might want to approach that?
I think they're a fabulous thing. So I think they're a really great thing, and I think they're gonna attract people and everything, but I do think it creates some additional element that whatever we're considering the max, if that's a very distinct possibility and we need to have that incorporated in the max, whatever we agree is the max, I think we should consider that's a likely outcome.
It's being treated as a 4th floor.
Yeah, I'm not sure if you want to allow it, if you want to take this opportunity to address it, because it's light, it's noise. And you're talking about something new coming into an area that's well established. And so the folks that are already there didn't have a choice to buy or, you know, not buy someone with a noisy lit party patio over their home. I think that should be really considered carefully.
There's a couple ways, Hans, we could look at it. The high density residential that has an 80-foot height limit, has some step back requirements and some privacy requirements. We can look at that. We could also, you know, look at not allowing occupancy within a certain range of an existing, you know, single family or, you know, single family house of, you know, those kind of rooftop areas. Because they certainly can have an impact. I haven't been there yet, but I understand like the 23 Kitchens, I think, has a rooftop beer garden kind of place. And so I guess that's, you know, you get into that situation where, right, I mean, it can, you know, have some negative impacts. So we want to consider that. I think it's, right now, I don't think, remind me if I'm missing something, but I don't even think we have a 2-story building in a neighborhood commercial zone yet. So everything we've got so far is very suburban, very low slung, single story buildings. And so, you know, this is, you want to look at everything, right? You want to look at what the code allows ultimately, but at this point, we're not even to our second story yet in a neighborhood commercial area. So I'll make sure we're focusing on the right thing, but we can definitely look more into the privacy and the impacts of those, you know, potential rooftop areas.
But you can't see it happening when you start putting residential on top of commercial and then they
Yeah.
need to go up to.
Yeah, for sure. And I would also include in that things like balconies on, you know, if it's a mixed use building and you've got, you know, let's say you're on the backside of that building facing those houses with balconies on that side of the
Right.
building, you know, those kinds of same thing, so. Yeah, we can definitely take a look at that.
Yeah, and I think that also another thing that's coming to mind is whether or not that's a patio or residential use on top of the third story or fourth story, depending on how these are constructed, or if that's potentially a outdoor seating on the second story or on top of the first floor of a ground floor resident or restaurant use, I should say. So there might be a couple different additions there, depending on if that's a commercial or residential kind of rooftop patio that we're talking about. So
Yeah, you need to include community gardens in that too, because that is also becoming a popular feature.
Oh, yeah, rooftop gardens, yeah.
all right, so that's definitely something we can look at. And then proposed setbacks. So yeah, right now it's along the front of the neighborhood commercial districts. That is a 10-foot setback. And the newly proposed language would be reducing that down to a 5-foot setback. So really just bringing those businesses closer to that sidewalk and that interface there. With the caveat that if we do allow ground floor residential, or if there's some form of outdoor restaurant or outdoor seating, that there's additional opportunity for space there. So maybe increase to 15 feet to accommodate outdoor seating and or for ground floor residential uses is how it would be newly proposed. So dropping it from 10 down to 5, so it's closer, but then still creating that space for gathering spaces and seating and things like that. And then rear minimums would stay the same, and then side minimums would stay the same, with the caveat that if it is located on a corner, that the front maximum would apply to that corner use. So, any thoughts on that one?
Sorry, I do. So why? That's what we all love. When it's a sunny day, we want to go to our coffee shop, our cafe, or wherever, and we want to sit out in outdoors. Why are we wanting the max? Just to utilize the space or go back to the 75-80% of the property? Why are we considering a max of 5 feet?
Yeah, so the max really ensures that commercial uses that are constructed aren't recessed deeply on the property, and that there's big expanses between the commercial use and the sidewalk. So that's kind of the driver behind that. It's something that we've used within our form-based code within the Woodland District and some of our other commercial districts. It's really just to bring the proximity between commercial uses and those that are walking by or accessing it from the sidewalk closer together, so that folks from the sidewalk can see into those businesses and vice versa, that businesses and those that are shopping within them can see out to the sidewalk.
So it would increase to 15 feet if somebody is planning for the space to be something where they would want outdoor seating, but if it's just gonna be like built by somebody and then leased out later, it may or may not have the 15 feet, then correct?
Correct. Yep. So if it would be some form of a restaurant use or outdoor coffee shop thing, or a coffee shop with outdoor seatings you're talking about, those would all have the opportunity to be recessed so they can accommodate additional seating. But if it's going to be something that's more like a clothing shop, bookstore, what have you, those things might be pushed up closer to the sidewalk when they're not typically types of uses that would require additional seating out front.
So realistically, though, a developer's going to build it and then get tenants later. So we wouldn't know the specificity of the use when we're approving the building, correct? Isn't that generally how it is? Most strip malls are developable, the tenants are determined at a later point.
And to build on that, would that prohibit a future change in the purpose of that space? Let's say it was built at 15 because they had the rationale of outdoor seating. It's a restaurant, but then that changes hands and somebody who wants to start a clothing store wants to use that space. Are they then prohibited to use the space for anything other than outdoor dining or a restaurant because it's already built that way?
So that's something that we do address as far as a potential change of use. So when, say, a restaurant exists at a location, and then some other type of use, whether it's a clothing store or a daycare or something else that's measurably different in the way that that location is used, we do look at that as part of the permitting process. That wouldn't necessarily be something that would prohibit that use from going in there, as long as they remain consistent with everything else that is within the chapter. That wouldn't be a deal breaker per se.
But so can we ask to allow curtain wall construction so that that space up to 15 feet can be flexed according to the tenant that's in there?
That's what I was just gonna kind of mention something along the same lines, which is maybe we go for, instead of just like a hard and fast 5 and 15, is that we maybe do a range of between 5 and 15 and not worry so much about the use that's going in there. Cause the market is gonna dictate the use. That, you know, if it is a restaurant that's going in first and then the restaurant goes out of business and then daycare goes in behind it, doesn't really matter. They can use that front space maybe for some planters or for some, parents to sit outside while they wait for the kids, whatever. Maybe we don't focus too much on that, the outdoor seating part, and we just go with a 5 to 15, understanding that the intent still is to push the buildings up to the street. And I think, the idea with that is that most of this is gonna be, or, the concept of the neighborhood commercial is that it's primarily to be used by the residents. Walking and biking to the location, and so it really should be oriented around kind of that street that's there versus the parking lot. In terms of, if you're thinking of like a standard strip mall where you pull right up to the front of the door, right? This is gonna be something where it's gonna be oriented more on the street. Yes, it does have parking in the back, but it's gonna be more, and I think a range of 5 to 15 gets us in that and doesn't necessarily.
And it adds to the attractiveness of design, if you can vary that as a builder.
Right.
15, just 15 feet. This table is probably 15 feet long. That's not that big.
No,
right?
and if you
It still
think
pushes
about-
the building right up.
If you think about the primary intention is to have people on bikes and walking, you need 15 feet to spread out, to have more people around. So I think that's a better approach, is to have a.
Well, cities are going into the street to get their 15
I
feet,
know.
and so,
Parking spaces.
and so they do, the cities allow the parking to become dining for restaurants, so not, Olympia did that and other bigger cities do that, so.
I will note that this is in addition to the sidewalk that would exist and the planter strip that would exist beyond the parcel line. So that is something. So it is kind of accumulative of that distance plus the sidewalk plus the planter strip all the way to the street. So there is room to play with that kind of open or mixed kind of community space, if you will. But yeah. Any other comments on this or thoughts? All right, we'll keep moving then. So proposed frontage is one, this is a new area that we haven't fully discussed yet. And a lot of this is pulled from our form-based code within the Woodland District. So the top one here talks about commercial weather protection. So that's things like awnings that protect the sidewalk from the weather. And these measurements here, so 15 feet minimum depth. So that's, I think you can see my little laser pointer here. but that's the length of this word where it says art gallery, which is how far out from the building it extends. And then heights of 8 to 12 feet. So that's the height from the sidewalk up to that awning. That's that first requirement there. And this would be, as it's currently written, specific to commercial uses. So that wouldn't be residential, whether that's residential access on the ground floor to above floor residential, or if that's a mixed use resident or multifamily residential building with ground floor residential. They would have different standards. So this is just for commercial uses. And then commercial windows, windows along 60% of the frontage. So that would be the frontage where the business faces the street. Again, that's pulled from our Woodland District and our form-based code. There is some variation that was in the draft that discusses grocery stores and how there's some flexibility there that they don't necessarily need to fully adhere to that. Given the need for kind of wall space within a grocery store and how windows kind of relate to that. One additional piece of text in here talks about reflective, dark tinted, or textured glass not being permitted. So actually lately we've had a lot of different prospective developers call in about the 6% window requirement and whether or not they can do window treatments on top of that that would essentially turn them into signs or eliminate that view from the street into the business and back and forth. So this text would really work to address that and ensure that that line of sight is maintained. And then primary commercial entry doors, this really just ensures that those businesses do face the street and are intended to have their primary access onto the street so that they don't just really effectively serve the parking lot, but that they also have street interaction and frontage there, and that is the focus of each one of these buildings. So they're oriented in a way that really kind of brings people in off the street. And then the last bullet down here talks about vehicle access. None of this has really changed. This is all still consistent based on how it's written today, but different requirements, whether or not you're located on a corner lot as far as access or interior lot. So a lot that doesn't have a corner on two different streets, with some built-in flexibility for the site plan review committee to adjust that as needed if there's center planter strips or roundabouts or things like that. So still a little bit adaptive to whatever the space is, but limitations on how much vehicle access there is that could dice up a sidewalk. But yeah, this is all relatively new for you guys. Is there anything in here that jumps out at you or any thoughts on this?
Yes. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
I'm not following why we're being so restrictive. I think we run the risk of being so restrictive about the awnings or the windows. I think we're envisioning the use of these and not planning for the future. So, maybe the thing becomes that, restaurants don't want windows in the front or, and I don't know, I wonder why we would need to be so restrictive on the awnings for the, you would wear hats, carry an umbrella, and why the windows and why the no reflective. I'm not following. I think ideally we think that would be prettier, more charming and such, but I'm not sure. I think that we could envision that there could be reasons people wouldn't want to do that or wouldn't need that, and then we've required it.
Yeah, so a lot of this, oh, sorry, Eddie, go ahead.
I was just going to respond to that, Daphne. I think to me, the big reason is to make it more pedestrian friendly as opposed to car friendly. That is the whole idea, is to try to make it so that people are interacting with it at the street level and not just pulling into a parking lot and going into a big box kind of place. That's what I see when I see these types of design elements that are required. Is that where they're coming from, Hans, or? Yeah,
so what's being proposed tonight is a combination of things. So it's definitely we started with a broad-based community feedback where we heard that human scale more human-oriented emphasis was something that was important when we're looking at these districts. And then also when we went out and looked at the example districts that the community identified as kind of their ideal version of what these districts could be, and started looking for common themes, common characteristics, looking at their code, seeing what was replicated or duplicated within each one of those locations. These were the types of characteristics that we saw throughout each one of these districts that really kind of contributed to the feel of these districts. And that was also the other component of the feedback that we got, is that the character and the design elements and kind of the feel is more important than the actual intended use or the required or allowed use. So these design elements allow us to create more of the fit and feel of the location without putting as much limitation on the exact use that could go into these locations. We do have some uses listed later on, but they are a little bit more broad-based and flexible as far compared to what the current code is today. So that is kind of where that shift is coming from. Looking at the example districts and also other districts that we have within Lacey, this level of design detail is pretty standard and something that we're seeing more and more replicated both within Lacey, but then within other communities. So it's not unfamiliar or unusual, I would say, as far as recent code examples that we've looked at.
Can I throw you a curveball here?
Sure.
Could you go onto Google Maps and bring up the street view for like where Mod Pizza is and Five Guys, Pacific Avenue and Slater Kinney?
Yeah, I mean, those glass storefronts with those awnings that are below 12 feet really creates a very comfortable place for pedestrians to be, and they're very attractive.
Oh, I don't disagree about the aesthetics on this. So I'm not in any way suggesting this does not make for a very pedestrian friendly, very nice aesthetic use of the building. But it is very, very specific. And I don't, like, what if this art gallery wanted to have murals instead of windows and solid walls? Would we think that's not aesthetic? No, we'd love to see some local artists do murals and that's their entrance. I think we're creating a restriction that's unnecessary. But I agree, I wanted it to be pedestrian friendly, I want it to be inviting, but I think we're basing on what we envision now and not the future.
And I do see that there are some businesses that with a glass window in the front would then immediately build a wall and a counter behind to block the view of what's going on in the back. Do you see what I mean? So it's a little difficult. I'm thinking of those 4 or 5 storefronts that are on the corner across from where Five Guys and those guys are, that were built on spec and have never rented, but they look
All
like
glass.
that. They're all glass.
But they're glass that faces the.
There's other issues there. I understand. There's access is a huge issue.
But then I'll tell you, what about El Gaucho and the Melting Pot in downtown Tacoma, where there's a red door for El Gauchos with, you can't see in there.
No.
And then you walk right next door, you know, literally right next door, and you have open windows for the Melting Pot because it's a different business.
Yeah.
And they want people looking in and seeing people using the fondue and doing the thing. So I mean, I'm following some of what you're talking about, where if we're so restrictive, you know, if we're kind of like cannery rowing it, you know, or trying to do that kind of theme, then yeah, I get it. I mean, then you want everything to look kind of cool and people walk along and have the cover. In Washington, I'm not sure covers help anyway, but I was downtown Olympia under a cover and ended up sopping wet, so. But I kind of get that. I mean, you start narrowing down usage, like they start thinking, well, we're restricted here. We have to do this, we have to do this, we have to have glass windows.
Yeah, it's
They've got to be tinted or untinted or whatever we're saying, and all of a sudden, yeah, we're creating uniformity.
this doesn't seem so bad where I grew up. They have like 3 shades of green or blue that you can use, and there's 2 shades of white, and
Yeah.
most have, like, I think asking for windows and sunlight isn't
Once you wanna
too
bring up that,
terribly
that's for you
restrictive.
if you've got it.
Yeah, sorry, I heard you say Mod Pizza. I didn't hear which one. Which one are you talking about?
Pacific Avenue and in Slater Kinney, there's Mod Pizza and Five Guys
7-Eleven,
and Chipotle.
Gotcha. All right. Yeah, I can bring that up.
So this is the section of town where this code already applies. So this is a good example of like, okay, if you were to implement this, what could it look like in practice? And there's a May Street.
But it's not a street view. There's no street entrances for any of those businesses.
No, you're right. These are all
These are all
pedestrian
entrances from parking lot behind them.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's even 7-Eleven.
Whatever we
So
say.
what did the 7-Eleven do? I believe they stuck a bunch of shelves open from.
No,
Yeah,
there's
they
an
covered the
entrance there on the
Did they-
corner. Right there behind that signal controller. That's an entrance. So there's door handles there. Yeah. So
But-
that's.
But are the windows,
And it's locked all the time.
do the windows, they have stuff blocking your view into the 7-Eleven?
Kind of on the bottom third there that, they've got some counters on that side. There's some,
I
Because
can.
the awnings cover the plants.
Yeah, we don't wanna water them.
So I guess this is what you get, is you get, a building push up to the street, you get a certain amount of glass and, here's, Chipotle's got their seating area off to the side. And so, and while I understand what you're saying, for us, I think as, what we're trying to portray is like a more like code, form-based code way of thinking about this. Like if you do it this way, then, Hans will get into this in a second, then the uses aren't really gonna matter because the uses are going to be those types of uses that want to take advantage of these types of buildings. In this case, it was things like Chipotle and Five Guys and 7-Eleven. In a neighborhood commercial area, it could be, something similar.
And out went the chuck wagon.
Plus, we're talking about, we're talking about neighborhood commercial too, right? This that we're looking at here is not neighborhood commercial. So I think making sure that the uses that are gonna go into those places are attracted to the type of building that the neighborhoods want in their neighborhood is important as well. So as Hans was saying, it's not necessarily the use, but how it's going to look to the rest of the neighborhood and what it's going to do to the character of the residential area where it's going in. And I think it's important that there be some design elements that are required there in order for the community to not say, look at that monstrosity that they built down there on the corner. I think it's important that it blend in with the neighborhood in some way and interact with the neighborhood. And but by doing these things, I think that's what we're trying to accomplish. I don't think it's too restrictive.
I think
It
that's
could
already
be.
covered in the code under compatibility, right?
I think so.
When, it's gotta be compatible to
Yes.
the neighborhood.
So that's in our design.
It's
review
already
section.
in there.
Correct, but it's not as prescriptive as what Hans is providing
Yeah.
here. So in our old model, we would go, the old kind of use-based model, we would say, these are the uses that are allowed. And then here's our design guidelines, which aren't the same as these hard and fast requirements like what we're talking about here. We're talking about actually taking those design guidelines and making them more the requirements and then essentially allowing the uses to kind of take care of themselves. And so it's almost a
It's a switch.
inverse in the way that we've been regulating the neighborhood
I
commercial
don't
areas.
remember anybody in the commercial or in those neighborhood commercial things complaining necessarily about the design of a building going in. It was particularly about the type and function of the building that was going in.
So about the uses.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it was less, I mean,
And maybe this would be a good segue into actually getting into the uses. I think we can continue this discussion, I think, but getting into some of the uses will help kind of, because we'll get into gas stations, we'll get into those kinds of things here with, drive-through windows. Those are things that we want to start getting into. So let's maybe not focus so much on those design requirements and get into the uses, and we can kind of, Hans and I have heard, there's maybe not full alignment on this. Maybe we can kind of come up with some options that might help kind of thread the needle and address.
It'd be like a dentist office though, too, right? And so they're not necessarily gonna want everybody seen in them grinding somebody's teeth kind of thing, so.
But that may be a dentist's office says, hey, maybe that's not the best place for us to go.
Too true.
Right,
but-
the dentist is not necessarily the one that's gonna be building the space, it's gonna
No,
be
they're
somebody that's building it, to lease it. And the dentist office might not be there forever, so we need to think about it in terms of, but that building will be there 50 to 100 years. What does that building look like, as those tenants turn over? And if we just say, well, it's built as a dentist's office and nothing other than a dentist can go in there, then you lose that flexibility.
Agree, I think it needs to be flexible.
But if you look at like Vetter Dental on State Avenue, they're all glass front.
I agree, I think they need to be flexible, and I think being restrictive limits flexibility. I'll stop, I promise. I feel strongly on that one, if you couldn't tell.
Yeah, and really just to cap that portion of our discussion off, there is that balance of what we're hearing from the business or the developer community and what we're hearing from the neighborhood residential adjacent communities that live around these districts. Consistently, the adjacent neighbors are looking for more design elements, more restrictive in the character of these locations and how well they assimilate into the immediate surroundings. And the commercial developers are looking for as much latitude and kind of freedom to build whatever they want in these locations. So trying to figure out what that happy middle ground is that tries to make as many people happy as possible, given, the middle ground never really does, but at least it's something that we can all kind of coalesce around and kind of compromise on to find that character that we're looking for. But yeah, Ryan and I will get together and we'll keep looking at some additional options on that one. The next couple of slides that we have here move into proposed uses. So in our code, the way it's currently written, we have quite a long list and a very detailed list that really defines each type of use, all the way from Blockbuster Video to internet cafes and everything between. We pulled back a little bit from that model and did kind of larger umbrella categories, if you will, that encompass a lot of different types of uses. And we actually got rid of all conditional uses. So either it is permitted or it's not. So it removes a lot of the ambiguity of these different uses and a lot of that difficulty figuring out where you can cite different types of commercial uses and the design elements that are attached to them. That said, the first one here is residential. Currently, this top bullet is all that these districts do in discussing residential. So residential above ground floor commercial, that's how it's currently written. We want to carry that forward for sure, but then also looking at ground floor options as far as multifamily goes, based on the feedback that we've received to date. So including ground floor as an option, with two potential caveats or additions in here: permitted within districts with 15,000 square feet of commercial space. So again, commercial is the primary use and emphasis of these districts. So ensuring that that's there, but then also allowing for that residential to kind of further support and stimulate that commercial use. So that was bullet number one. And then also by including ground floor multifamily residential, there is an opportunity to soften those district edges between adjacent residential uses and the core kind of commercial component, if you will. So located away from district corners being kind of the primary focal point where all the activity is. So located away from those and then used also as buffers to adjacent residential uses, as we were talking about there. And then I did add one additional one here of live work style buildings and structures. That is something that we're seeing more of show up. We have one example that I think we talked about at our last meeting was Serenity Apartments with the live work setup on the ground floor. And that while that is something that we do want to encourage, we don't want that to represent the entirety of commercial uses within these districts. So placing a potential cap on how much of that 15,000 square feet requirement can be represented by live work style uses. So that's the residential section as far as proposed uses that we've kind of drafted up for you today. Any thoughts on that initially?
I just have I have a question that I don't know the answer to, and that is, with two-story with residential on top, is there an ADA requirement to install elevators in those buildings? No.
No.
4 stories, I believe.
And based on recent building code and kind of what we're looking at, even some 4-story buildings won't have that requirement. So there is a little bit more flexibility built in there, and that is why 4-story buildings are becoming more of interest to developers, because there's ways to work around that elevator requirement. That said, if we do accommodate ground floor residential uses, there would still be accessible residential options on the ground floor that wouldn't need an elevator to access them. Does that help? Okay, I'm gonna keep moving on here. Food is the next category. It's a pretty broad-based one, but I did want to kind of lump it in with a couple other things. So we have things like brew pubs and public houses listed here, eating and drinking establishments with the condition of them being non-drive-through. Currently within these districts, drive-through is not something that is currently allowed as it's written. That said, we have heard feedback and interest both as part of this process and historically that drive-through uses is something that is both of interest to the community, but then also to prospective developers. So working in a component here that's drive-through as an accessory use to things like bakeries, cafes, and coffee shops with indoor seating. So it's not purely vehicle oriented in that sense, that there is still a community kind of gathering component to it. Coming at it in this approach, it also does limit things like more chain style kind of fast food options that may not be a great fit for these more neighborhood oriented commercial districts. So that's kind of what the bullet is there. And then not permitted between the street and the building. So not having those drive-throughs or stack up lines existing between the street and the building, kind of isolating both the building and the sidewalk from each other. So that's something that we did see in other districts, and we wanted to make sure that really there is that interaction between the uses and the sidewalk in that public space. So if a drive-through were to be proposed, that would be on the back side of the building or located in a way that doesn't prohibit that access to that commercial use. And then grocery stores and supermarkets being the last one, which was very popular. But any thoughts, questions, comments on that one?
Would the language actually include like bakery, cafe, and coffee shop, or would we want to just be more generic, drive-through as an accessory use to, because could it be a drive-through pharmacy or something? Would we want to be that specific?
It definitely could be. We could add a pharmacy for sure.
Do we want to list though? Do we want to actually list?
Like Hawks Prairie.
Yeah, that's a little drive-through.
Yeah,
And
and they do really good business.
really popular and a great,
Yeah.
something local to a community, very,
Pretty unobtrusive too.
so maybe avoid a list. Cause that's kind of why we got trouble with the blockbusters and stuff, so I don't know.
Yeah, so it's one of the things that we did here. I think pharmacy is a great example of a good option here. Is that we want these to be kind of local oriented. And by removing what it's conditional to as far as a list of uses, we do run the risk of opening up to things like your fast food restaurants, which we heard was not really something that folks were looking for in these districts. So finding a way that potentially accommodates drive-throughs, which based on the feedback we've heard, seems like a popular option, but also doesn't kind of fully open those gates to every type of potential use that is heavily reliant on a drive-through for the majority of their business.
McDonald's doesn't really want neighborhood commercial though. That's not, there's not enough traffic. They want, you know, an
They need
interstate or a
more-
major
they need
highway.
more volume,
Yeah, so.
but maybe a cleaners. I don't
Oh,
know.
cleaners, that, yeah, have pickup, sidewalk pickup.
I don't know.
Okay, yeah, so we can work on some potential options there as far as how to phrase that one. Yeah, just the emphasis being kind of making sure that it's that local kind of neighborhood scale clientele versus kind of a larger regional look. So
Can I, Hans, I have a question, not about the use, but maybe a little more on the not permitted between the street and the building aspect of it. I guess I'll go on the record to say I know I'm in the minority, but I just detest drive-throughs in general. I think there's so many reasons why I don't like them, but the way they break up pedestrian and bicycle access is probably the biggest one, and they're so unsafe. I don't know what it is about a drive-through, but people forget how to drive when they're in one, and they want to run people over on the sidewalk, and I don't like them at all. But is there more requirements about visibility and you know, how a drive-through would work other than not permitted between the street and the building? Or is that the only actual physical requirement that would?
So within neighborhood commercial districts, this would be the only component that would really speak to drive-throughs. We have other design requirements that address drive-throughs more specifically that would just apply to all of our districts in any instance of a drive-through. So there are requirements as far as visibility and access and things like that that are addressed in other chapters.
So would the same requirements that we saw earlier about like only having one entrance onto the street and that type of thing still apply, so they wouldn't have, I don't know, I'm just trying to, you know, picture trying to walk down the Slater Kinney past all the drive-throughs there, McDonald's and Arby's and all that, and you take your life in your own hands if you were actually going to try and walk that sidewalk, because people pull out of drive-throughs and have no, you know, they're looking in their bag to see if they got everything, and you're a hood ornament. But and it just breaks up the whole, you know, the whole sidewalk and the pedestrian experience really by having to dodge all those drive-throughs. And so I'm just wondering if there's, you know, how would that work if a development only has one entrance onto the street and there's a drive-through in there for the pharmacy that's in there and there's 4 other businesses there? How would that all work?
Yeah.
Can I add, so what Hans is mentioning is we have some, what I'll say, catch-all drive-through regulations that apply in any commercial area across Lacey. And I'll just go quickly through what those state, which I think maybe get to some of what you're talking about, Eddie. So number 1, the entrance and the exit cannot be located on a public street. So it has to be the entrance and the exit to the drive-through have to be within the actual site itself. The drive-through and the drive-through window shall be screened when visible from a public street. It could include architectural projections, fencing, landscaping, or a combination of elements. Drive-through lanes and windows shall be located a minimum of 150 feet from adjacent residential uses. Unless the residential use is separated from the lane or window by an arterial street. If separated by a street, then no distance requirement is required. A drive-through is permitted on the same property as a residential use, provided that the residential use is not located on the ground floor. And this gets to Eddie's number 5, drive-through lanes shall not result in queuing or stacking, which impedes pedestrian or bicycle access or mobility. And the last one is the drive-through shall be designed to ensure safety for drivers and pedestrians and avoid creating security dangers for customers or employees. So I think while it's, some of it maybe is open to interpretation as far as the safety and those kinds of criteria, it does provide a fairly rigid standard for drive-throughs where they're allowed. You know, distance from residential uses I think would be really important here as well to consider. So although we've got just not permitted between the street and building, there's more that applies that's not shown on this slide.
Okay.
So this would build upon those requirements. So in practice, what we would likely see in this is that that entrance or exit to the site would feed into the parking lot area, and then off of the parking lot area, you would be able to access some form of a drive-through that would feed you back into the parking lot area before you would exit or from the site again. So it's really building upon those drive-through requirements that apply to all commercial, and then taking it a step further that lane wouldn't be routed between the sidewalk and the commercial use.
Okay, thank you.
I would add, I have not advocated for drive-throughs at all. And then got told off by my niece, who has three kids,
Right.
1, 3,
Yeah.
5. And she looked at me and she says, Uncle Dave, what do I do? I've got 3 kids in the car. I can't do anything unless there's a drive-through about this. I've got to manage 3 kids, get them out of the car, keep them safe in a parking lot, which is dangerous in the first place, right, for kids, because they're shorter. And I said, boy, thanks. I'm more aware of the world than I was.
A lot of the
I didn't have
restaurants-
my own kids.
A lot of the restaurants like Chipotle, I think is one of them, so you pull up into the parking spot, there's a QR code on
Yeah.
the sign or whatever, and they bring it out to you.
Another
And
great
and so
thing.
it's car side. So that's one alternative to, being able to.
That's how she does all of her grocery shopping now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
She goes online, Aldi's or something.
Delivers,
even
they
the-
deliver, yeah.
Starbucks over here on Slater Kinney, that drive-through line is very inconspicuous unless you're in the parking lot.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty good.
So I actually have a question about the language here that you say drive-through is an accessory use to bakery, cafe, or coffee shop. And what I hear, Hans, is your intention is to keep it local, not a franchise, but that's the definition of Starbucks. So are you legally prohibited from saying no franchises? Why don't you say it when that's your intention?
I'd have to get back to you on that one. I actually don't know if that's what the legal wording is on that one. Coffee shops.
You don't
was
want
something-
Starbucks, right? You want a mom and pop having the opportunity for that.
So I'll tell you, there's been a lot of court precedent on that. And when communities try, like Leavenworth did that,
Yeah.
and where my family's from, Jackson, Wyoming, did that, they've lost in court every single time.
Well,
You can impose design restrictions.
Something we can think
but
about,
you
our,
can't prevent the
You
business.
can't prevent the business.
but when
Yeah,
people
our
want a
intent-
Starbucks,
well,
people love their Starbucks.
Yeah, I know, and our intent here was not necessarily in dealing with anything franchise related, it was more about not espresso stands. We don't wanna allow an espresso stand, that's why we've got the indoor seating requirement.
Oh,
So
Not
we
like
weren't,
a
we
so
weren't,
it's not a little shack that you see up and down?
yeah,
That's
so
what you don't.
I
we weren't,
see.
we weren't thinking about franchises, that wasn't,
Okay,
we weren't.
that makes sense when you put the inclusion of the indoor seating, yeah.
Yeah, so if there's certain uses in that list that you don't wanna see, if it, yeah, that maybe all adds up to being a Starbucks. If that's not what you think is being a neighborhood scale restaurant or use, then we can eliminate that. I mean, coffee is, in my mind, a neighborhood necessity. And people oftentimes utilize a drive-through to do that. Now, where it becomes more of a regional thing is where you have an espresso stand, where you're not doing any business inside, you're just literally, it's just a,
Sure.
yeah, and then, that's commuters getting coffee, that's different than having an inside spot to sit.
Good, thank you.
Yeah, we have a little local coffee shop at the end of my neighborhood and I use the drive-through. On my way to church or something, like, I'll just get a coffee and go. It's easy.
So that's everything that we have on food. Are there any other comments on that one right now? All right, and then I believe, okay, yeah, so we have commercial. This is, again, broader brush strokes, if you will. We used to really kind of identify every type of commercial that was allowed within these districts. And these are we've dialed that back a little bit. So these are more generalized. So we have things like medical and health services, community and civic facilities, commercial uses, professional services, offices, retail specifically that is primarily for in-person or direct customer sales. So we don't want this to be kind of online or not focusing on the community directly surrounding that retail location. And then services, so all activities must occur within the building. So we don't want to see things like mechanics or things like that where there's supplies or materials that are kind of stacking up around these locations. And then rooftop community solar as an accessory permitted use. That's one that's kind of getting into these locations a little bit, and we can talk about that. But that's at a high level, kind of the commercial things that we're looking at there. And again, it's really more the design elements that dictate kind of how these different types of uses would fit within these districts, less so than the actual kind of use itself. So we're seeing these kind of broad categories. Any thoughts on that? Any questions, any comments?
I remember part of the survey was listing prohibited businesses. Is that still on the radar of having a prohibited list?
So currently, as our district or as our code is written, anything that is not identified or characteristically similar to these allowed uses would be prohibited. We didn't have a specific prohibited list as part of our code as it's written today. I have added actually a prohibited category that includes things like warehouses and mini storage and a couple other elements that were specifically called out. So that will be farther down on the slide deck. Did you have a type of use or something that you were thinking of?
I was curious to see what had come out of the summary decisions more than adding to it. Just to see what had come out from the feedback.
Yeah, so as far as the feedback, a lot of what we're seeing is that there's that shift from specifically listed uses to more design style approaches. So a little bit more flexibility and relaxing the uses and getting a little bit more detailed when it comes to the actual character and feel of these areas as far as design elements. But yeah, the next one that we have here, I think, is the one that we're going to hear about. It's one of the big reasons that this started in the or that we started this process to begin with, but it is gas stations. And I do want to circle back to that north versus south comments within the survey. Again, gas stations were prominently featured throughout the feedback that we've heard, specifically Meridian Market and how that interacts with the immediate neighborhood. The farther that we get away from Meridian Market, the less gas stations were prominently featured one way or the other. And then the other topic that I did want to identify is that we currently have this gas station here, which is out on Yelm Highway, and then the Meridian Market one, which has been approved at least through plan review and seems to be moving forward. So we're going to, in the very near term, have 2 gas stations that will exist within these neighborhood commercial districts. So one of the tasks that we wanted to make sure that we succeeded at was figuring out a way that addresses gas stations, provides limitations to them, but then also doesn't outright prohibit the 2 that we already have or will have in place within these districts. So finding what that balance is. And again, the farther we moved away from Meridian Market, the less the gas stations were viewed as a negative, and actually in some instances were viewed as a asset to those locations. So what we have here is gas stations in 2 different contexts. One as an accessory use to a full service grocery store. When we were working or reaching out to different developers and when we were talking to different existing tenants, one of the things that we heard is that grocery stores really are only going to, certain grocery store chains are really only going to consider locations that also have a gas station component to them. So that was something that we heard and something that we wanted to make sure that we could accommodate if that is something that that opportunity arises in the future. And then the other bullet that we have here is not less than 1.5 street miles from another station. So this one was added as a way to reduce the possibility of future gas stations existing within neighbor commercial districts while still accommodating the two that will be in these districts in the near future. The one that we see here, the Chevron one out on Yelm Highway, and then two, the Meridian Market. Looking at the distribution of the neighborhood commercial districts, that 1.5 street miles really encompasses all of the other districts. So outside of those two that we're talking about, there's really not an opportunity for another one based on that requirement, unless it was accessory to a grocery store, some form or another. So that's the top bullets there. And then these bottom
1.5 miles just to essentially prohibit any of the other one. Okay, so I'm just like looking for the method on this. And so there was okay.
So Meridian Campus took the bullet for the rest of Lacey.
And then we did a little
Yeah.
scale of miles, and
Yeah.
if we did 1.5 miles, we're good.
Yeah, so this is, we're gonna get feedback on this no matter what, and I think that there's some strongly held opinions on this in both directions. This is a way that really kind of seeks to address that in practice, but at the same time doesn't prohibit the two that are already gonna be in place. So that was kind of the thinking behind that wording there anyways. And then the bottom three bullets are just adding additional kind of limitations on the scale of these locations and how they can be, where they can be sited and how they can be kind of used. So the first one is limited to 2 fueling station pump islands serving no more than 4 vehicles at any one time. That is actually pulled from, I think, the Proctor district. So gas stations, including the Chevron you see kind of in the background here, does have more fueling stations than that. There was an opportunity to reduce or limit the number of fueling stations as part of the Meridian Market. This is just kind of more formalizing that. So while gas stations could be possible, the kind of intensity of that use can be kind of scaled back a little bit. So that's what that first bullet is there. And then
Is that going to is that going to obviate the grocery store option? I don't know of a grocery store that has only 2 fueling stations.
It may, and that's something that we'll need to kind of reach out to the development community and figure out, but also, it's important to consider that these are to be neighborhood scale and,
Well, it's not a grocery, it's not a huge grocery store.
yeah, and even if they want, gas, then if it's, for example, you see there in that photo, I think that has 4 pumps with 8 fueling stations. It's a fairly large canopy.
Yeah.
The other one that is kind of a similar size is the 7-Eleven that's on the north side of I-5 on Marvin Road. That's what we also limit the number of gas pumps in the Hawkesbury Business District to 4. So this is, kind of half that size, which is the intent is to be more neighborhood scale. And not a huge regional draw for, your gas station type thing. So it's more of a grocery store that just happens to have a couple gas pumps than, a major regional draw.
Yeah.
And then the second to last bullet here gets back to kind of what we were discussing as part of the drive-throughs. But again, it's in reference to where those stacking lanes are and idling vehicles and really ensuring that those are moved away from that public kind of street gathering space. And then also the last one, this is something that we heard throughout a lot of the feedback as far as the proximity to things like residential uses, parks and schools. So adding a distance requirement attached to any fueling areas that they're at least 100 feet away from those types of uses. So yeah,
So
feedback on that one?
not on the gas station, other than the north-south. I just really think we should be continuous. I don't really think we should have, we're trying to fight Martin Way where we're not consistent, and I understand that's proximity based, but we're trying to have a more attractive Lacey overall. So I can't see us adopting something for the north that we're not for the south. I see no reason to. I understand the sentiments were much different on the surveys, and I respect that, but I think that was just the proximity of that one versus the others not necessarily not caring, but
Yeah.
yeah, so I would strongly believe we have a consistent zoning for all of Lacey.
I agree with that, and I think in 5 years, if you did the same survey, they'd be about even north and south.
Yeah.
Right now, the wound is still raw.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, and it's not just the gas station. I mean, you're probably tuned into this, but on Sunday morning, there was a double trailer overturned at the Circle in the north. And it was at the Circle by the new Hogan Bay development in front of 23 Kitchens. And it was 10 o'clock on a Sunday morning, blocking everything, crushed all the landscaping on Meridian Campus Commercial Association with these 2 trucks. And I think they were out there for about 5 hours. And the responding tow trucks made multiple efforts to try to lift. The driver was trapped inside the cab for a period of time. You probably all know this, being, connected. It wasn't on a work day, but it was in our city. But I think things like that, because of all the Amazon warehouses and everything else that were put in the north, there will continue to be sensitivities about these big trucks. Cause you said it was gas stations and big trucks, right? That kind of were highlighted on the north. And this is ongoing every day. Something like this is present, interrupting life in the north where all of this development just happened. A lot of sensitivities there still.
Yeah, the trucks and the gas stations were 2 things that, while those conversations did exist throughout the survey and throughout the Lacey community, there was definitely a heightened level of discussion the farther north you moved and the closer to the Meridian Market location you got. The trucks were typically in reference to actually the industrial districts that are out there. So there was some crossover as far as different types of uses that are not necessarily neighborhood commercial district related, but still kind of add to that experience that were captured within the survey. So that's also some of the discussion that we were seeing in that.
Is that on your radar?
I heard about it, yeah.
It's not on the scanner, yeah.
Yep.
I was the one that posted the video to the scanner page. Yeah.
Any other thoughts on gas stations? Okay. And then prohibited uses. So this is the, I believe this is the last bullet in here. So keeping it a little bit simpler, we have allowed uses and prohibited uses. The usual text that we have within each one of our districts is uses other than those identified or described. So that everything that we just listed would be in the LMC 1636-20. So that's kind of referencing back to that previous section that typically exists directly above the prohibited section. But we did want to take it a step further as far as stacking lanes and truck loading zones adjacent to residential uses, getting at both idling, the kind of the sound impacts, but then also the potential diesel fumes and impacts of that. Outdoor storage or repair. So we talked about that a little bit, but we just wanted to make sure that that was clearly stated. And then warehousing and mini storage. Those are 3 different types of uses that were frequently referenced that we heard were not a great fit for neighborhood commercial districts. So we want to make sure that that was captured there. But yeah, are there any other uses that come to mind that may make sense in this category? Any other thoughts? Any other feedback?
Agree on all of those.
What about the cannabis stores? Is there any thought or restriction on that?
So that actually wasn't strongly featured with any of the feedback that we received. There are cannabis or marijuana stores in other example districts that were identified as part of this as ideal examples of what these districts could be. But again, that wasn't a prominent discussion topic within any of the feedback that we received. So based on what we're looking at today and kind of the wording of what we've reviewed within the commercial section specifically, that would be a potentially allowed use, provided they are consistent with all of the other design requirements that were reviewed.
I guess what I'm thinking about in terms of the impact to the community is what we hear a lot in the news is until marijuana is federally sanctioned, these businesses have to operate in a very vulnerable state, right, with cash. And therefore, what we see in the news a lot is crime associated, people driving vehicles into the front of the stores to get the cash of the product, and maybe that invites a higher crime rate until it's federally sanctioned and they can use credit cards and banks and all sorts of things. They're targets for criminals and very vulnerable. So that's where my thought process was going with having them in that area.
So we don't have any specific city regulations at all on marijuana uses. They're regulated by the state liquor cannabis board, and that they also have, and one thing we can do is pull their regulations. They have most of them have buffers from sensitive land uses, so they've got to be more than 1,000 feet away from things like parks and schools and daycare centers and those kinds of things, which we did a number, I mean, it's been going the way back machine, it's probably been 10 years ago, where we did, 1,000-foot buffers around all of our sensitive land uses, and there was very little left. And that was when the push went from being like medical related, when it was back when it was dispensaries. We were doing a lot of work with the planning commission then. So, and most of those areas were in our kind of core commercial that allow for them. So, we can take a look at it here. My guess is that probably all, if not most, if not all.
Thurston County in our area, right?
What's that?
They're all in Thurston County.
Oh, no, we've got some in Lacey, for
Oh.
sure.
I remember the discussions, especially when we were discussing the medical. And it seems like when we drew the circles around the parks and the daycares and all that, there's no neighborhood
much allowed.
commercial that would even be allowed.
It's just unfortunate for the businesses because they are allowed to operate, but they're so vulnerable to the crime because they have to have all that cash.
Right.
However, now people are driving their cars into 7-Elevens and pizza stores, so,
Right, right.
wherever there's a cash machine.
But yeah, that's the end of my slides. So yeah, definitely at this point, any additional feedback, I've been taking notes this whole time. So thank you for everything that's been voiced so far. But if any other additional discussions or topics that you guys want to cover, I'd love to take whatever time we have left. It is 8 p.m. To do that.
So the
You need
gas,
to feel like
Little
this is a
sarcasm there.
lifetime project.
You're done, right? You're done.
so the gas stations, and I hate to bring up a new topic at 8 o'clock because I want to go home too. It's been a long, long day. Any discussions in your surveys about charging stations?
So we did look at charging stations. They're covered under a different section of our code that really has more to do with parking. There wasn't any feedback as part of the neighborhood commercial specific outreach that we did that addressed charging stations. I think really all the feedback that we did here was specific to gas dispensing stations, if you will, just because that they are really a vehicle oriented use, whereas charging stations are typically occupy a parking stall within a parking lot that already exists next to some other use that's the primary use. They're mostly a accessory use to something else, so they aren't a standalone issue that was at least brought up or referenced within the feedback that we heard.
Okay, well, gas stations too. I mean, the customers are noisier, right? I mean, just the internal combustion engine, so.
Yeah.
Hans, do you want to talk a little bit about next steps?
Yeah, so next steps are going to be taking the feedback that we had received tonight and coming up with some additional language to really kind of capture that. We do want to get this out to the community at large. This is definitely in draft format. That said, we do want to get this out to the community as soon as possible, just so we can get that broader community feedback, really get confirmation or otherwise that we're moving in the right direction, that we really are capturing what we've heard today. And then from there, while we're taking in that feedback, I think the next time that we're all going to potentially get together on this topic is going to be the joint council meeting. Is that track, Ryan, or is there another meeting?
We're actually gonna review the draft at the first meeting in January, so you've only seen really the concepts at this point. So what we'll do is we'll assemble it all into code language and bring it to you the first meeting in January. And then essentially release it to the public at the same time. And then at the joint meeting, have it be a topic of conversation at the joint meeting to introduce it to the council at that point. And then follow up probably in February with the public hearing. And then a recommendation, hopefully February into March to get that to the council around the March timeline.
Okay. Anything else? Okay, we will move
Well,
on.
Okay, go ahead. No.
What?
I wanted to make sure you talked about the meeting, but I thought you were ending the meeting. So you're not,
No, I'm not
okay.
ending the meeting. I'm going to
You have your
number
coat
11.
on. I thought you-
And then I have, Mark has a half hour. And mine, I cut it down to 45 minutes.
You scared me when you put the coat on.
Okay. So we're gonna move on to communication announcement.
I'll just go quickly through the calendar. So this is our last meeting of the year. So everybody, happy holidays and have a great new year. So our first meeting after the new year would be January 10th. Hans will be back with the final, well, not the final, but a draft neighborhood commercial code amendments. We'll also at that point elect a chair and vice chair. And I'll probably at that point have some new members as well. And then in preparation, we'll have the joint meeting on Tuesday, January 23rd. And so because you now moved to Wednesdays, the next meeting date is the next day. So we'll probably cancel that meeting. And so just have the two meetings in January, the first one on the 10th, and then the joint meeting on the 23rd would be your second meeting. So any questions on that? All right,
Is that it on that?
that's it.
Okay, and I want to give Mark a minute if he wants to say anything.
Yeah, I just, thank you. It's been a privilege and I've learned a lot, for these 6 years and over 100 meetings, and having a chance to learn from Ryan and all the staff members and on many briefings. But most of all, I'm appreciative of the climate, this informal climate that we have here, and the ability for us to have mutual respect through all of our discussions. And even when we disagree, no one's ever been disagreeable. And I think that I thank Ryan and Dave for that, because that's those climates are established at the top, and it's allowed us to have some great discussions and hopefully serve the community. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark.
Okay, I want to just take a minute, first of all, to thank all of you that have participated. Gail, Eddie online, Kirian, Mark, Jeff now, Judith, Daphne. I mean, and all along over the 6 years, we've had pretty much amazing group of people working very hard, Peggy, and just great people. And so I thank you all for that. Thank you for putting your trust in me to be chair for a few years. My adventure here started with Rick. A thank you to Rick, Ryan, Hans, Grant, thank you all. Special thanks to Mayor Ryder and the City Council for allowing me to kind of learn about our city. This has been a unique experience for me in my life, being involved in something like this, because, I've run a business, but this is a whole different ball of wax, I guess. It's been extremely an amazing learning experience to see how things run. And I would encourage anybody that can get people to be volunteers to do these kind of things for our city. Talk it up, let people know there's just so much you can learn about our city government that will make you a better citizen. And I would have to mention, Ryan mentioned it, the whole wastewater thing,
Stormwater.
stormwater, wastewater, everything. You know, what an interesting aspect of our city. A special thanks for the guy that makes it all understandable for me, is, as I've nicknamed Mr. H2O, Doug Christensen. And, you know, he brought it kind of, made it a life, you know, made it real. So again, thank you all.
Thank you.
Yep.
You guys are gonna be really missed.
Yeah.
And with that, we're adjourned.
Nice.
Thank you.
Happy holidays, everybody.
Okay.
Happy holidays.
Like, it was,